comfortable, explore the wonderful platform we have here, and be sure to pop on chat. Let us know your name and where you're tuning in from. And let's go with your earworm of the day. What song has been playing pretty much nonstop in your head since you've heard it recently? I've got 2 young kids at home, so mine is anything from the Encanto soundtrack. It's pretty much playing right now. I'm singing We Don't Talk About Bruno right now in my head. So good to see you, Stephanie, Cynthia, Barbara. Again, we'll get started in just a few moments here. You know how it is. Signing into webinars takes a minute. Got an outstanding panel for you today. Going to be tackling 6 key questions, each tied to one specific way to make your hiring process more efficient. And do not worry, we will save time at the end for you to ask Q&A. So please stay engaged, network in chat, listen to the answers, hear the soothing, dulcimer tones of my voice as we prepare for today's webinar. And again, if you're just tuning in, pop onto chat. Let us know your name, where you're tuning in from, and your earworm. What song is playing nonstop in your head? And we will begin our session in just a moment here. As you can see, the agenda is up on the screen. We're going to introduce our panel here in just a few moments. We're going to dive directly into our conversation, of course, saving time at the end for your Q&A. And then make sure you stick around for the end because we'll let you know how you can get your 1 hour of SHRM credit for attending today's webinar. It's important. Keep yourself certified. Jordan, Carissa, Anna, hello. Asha from Austin. Love your city. Thanks for joining us today. A technical question from Jordan on closed captioning. It's a very great question. I want to make sure that we have today's session as accessible for all. So let us know if there's something that is not coming through on the closed captioning. Of course, we have an open poll you should see on your screen about finding out more information about the panelists, about Checkr or Workable as well. Let us know through that poll. That way we'll be sure to get you in touch with folks who you want to continue the conversation with. And with that, making best use of time, I think we will be diving in to the panel here shortly. Again, my name is Damien Smith. I'm the Director of Community and Customer Marketing at Workable. Workable is a world-class applicant tracking system. And a spoiler alert, I'm on board because we are going to be diving headlong into creating a customer community here in the next few weeks. So if you are a Workable customer and are interested in connecting with folks within the industry and thought leaders such as yourselves, stay tuned because there will be more to come on that. And with that, I would love to introduce today's panel, who are going to be taking you through 6 ways to making your hiring process more efficient. With that, we'll go around the horn. Again, I'm Damien, dialing in from Boston, and I'm with Workable. I'd love to pass the torch over to Emily for an introduction.
Thanks, Damien. I'm Emily Gibson. I am the Director of Talent Acquisition for Red Canary. We are a cybersecurity startup that specializes in MDR. If you have no idea what that is, that's okay, because I didn't a year ago either. So it's an incredibly exciting industry, and I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Scott?
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Jennings. I'm the Director of Industry Strategy and Market Development at Checkr. So I'm lucky enough to work with our partners and our customers to understand how and why they use background checks, which is what Checkr specializes in order to hire more quickly, convert on more candidates, and be more fair all throughout the process.
Great. And as if by magic, it seems that Zayshawn is dialing back in just in the nick of time. Let's give him a second to connect.
And I'm joining from Tampa, Florida today. Well, actually Washington, D.C. today, but I live in Tampa, Florida.
And I'm joining from Denver. So I think I saw one person out there from Denver as well.
While we're waiting for our third panelist to join in, speaking of now that you know where we're from, be sure to let us know in chat where you're tuning in from. Beverly, Iowa. Beverly from Beverly? Is there a Beverly, Iowa? We got Dustin from Orlando, neighbors to Tampa, of course. Kayla, Stephanie, great to see all of you. We definitely want to be able to jump in and get these questions answered ASAP. So we're just going to wait on our third panelist, Zeeshan, to rejoin. And if you are over in the chat box, keep in mind that at the top of the screen, you should see various tabs for Q&A, polls, and people. You may not see polls. That might be something that only I can see. But you should be able to see Q&A. Feel free, as you're listening in to our panelists' responses to these questions, to ask your own questions. Once we complete our standard go through for the 6 questions that we have kind of lined up for you, we will gladly field some of the questions that you've listed. So take a look at what's being entered, and also if you see one that particularly resonates with you and your organization, feel free to upvote it. Whatever time we have, at the end of the session, we will dedicate it toward audience Q&A. And it looks like Zeeshan is back with us. Zeeshan, hopefully the technical difficulties are wrapped up, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Hey, yeah, apologies about that. My name is Zeeshan Shamsi, he, him. I am a director at the People Collective.
I think I may have jinxed him by saying about technical difficulties. Zeeshan will be dialing in just a moment. So without further ado, I think we're probably a good idea to dive into our first question and to get this party started. So with that, Emily, I'd love to start with you. Let's ask a real basic one, kind of set the stage. How do you suggest and advise folks to rank and prioritize specific roles and open recs to keep recruiters as focused as possible? Of course, a focused recruiter is going to be an effective recruiter. So how do we rank and prioritize those specific roles?
Yeah, I think there's always a fight for the prioritization across leaders. And I think the way I start with it is what is going to get the business farther. So, what do we really need right now as engineers, as sales folks? Like, what is going to help us move farther faster? How I typically do that is I'm meeting with our executives fairly regularly to make sure that we are aligned on what that looks like and what those needs are, because then we have support from the business from the top down as well, in shifting priorities. I know at a startup, you have to be able to shift pretty quickly because those priorities can change even within a week or sometimes a day. One example that I'm actively working through this week is we have a big push to hire some more software engineers. And so just how do I potentially deprioritize and have some of those conversations with leaders so that my recruiters can stay focused on what is the true need with the software engineers and make sure that we're dedicating enough recruiter screening time and sourcing time to get those candidates in the pipeline.
Yeah, makes sense. Scott?
Yeah, to pick up on it from there, most organizations have some type of annual operating plan. We call it the AOP at Checkr, but you may have your own planning process throughout the year. And typically that's going to talk about what are the investments that you're making for the coming year or the coming budget period. And then what are you looking to drive out of those investments? Ideally, you're reviewing that on a fairly regular basis. And that really should be driving where you're putting your recruiter investments as well. Because if you're looking to make big investments in, let's say, product-led growth, then certainly you're going to have to invest in engineers and folks that are building product. If you'd like to expand into new markets, you're going to have to look at the go-to-market team and understand, okay, there's sales, there's marketing, there's customer success. What are the investments that we need to make in order to get to the outcomes that we plan for in that AOP? And the nice part about that is that it's a physical planning document that everybody should be using as the North Star. And as a result of that, it's a more objective way to have a conversation with leaders within the organization that all want their recs prioritized. I always try to think there's got to be some objective way to have this conversation and some way to stack rank it. And of course, then you're going to want to revisit that plan on a regular basis as it changes, as you report to Wall Street or as you report to your own individual investors.
Yeah, when the business strategy dictates the hiring plan, it's kind of hard to fight your case if it's not high in the business priorities. So that makes a ton of sense.
It does. I've tried to do it. I've tried to do it, Damien. It doesn't work.
We get some secret sauce there. We'll start another webinar on exactly how to accomplish that. Let's see if Zeeshan looks like still having a little bit of trouble. So, you know what? We'll make sure he can catch up and give some commentary on that piece when he's able to connect. So let's just dive right into question number 2. I'd love to understand, and Scott, we'll start with you this time. I'd love to understand some ways that you would suggest to make job descriptions as clear as possible to candidates and match the reality of the open role. What are some tips and tricks that you would offer?
Yeah, a great question. I think a realistic description of what you actually need for the role is the most important piece of that rec, as opposed to, you always hear the term A player or I want a rock star. I've never heard the term I want a B player from anyone anywhere, which I always find kind of funny. But what are the basic tenets of what you have to have experientially in order to deliver on the role? Make sure that those are front and center, and that you're not necessarily laundry listing every single thing that you need. Chances are you don't need a PhD for most jobs. So if you list it there, that can be a little intimidating and perhaps keep people away from that role. So that's where I really think about the job description is that don't just put out there you want an A player. Of course, everybody wants an A player. And then also be very, very realistic about what you absolutely must have around that rec.
Yeah. I know I always encourage my recruiters to look at the position description and probe on some of those pieces in the intake meeting as well. So if, it's often you can get an outdated position description, or maybe the requirements are not as stringent as they initially were, or what they were thinking. I think one thing I've really appreciated about Red Canary is we really across the board do not have many education requirements. It's more about the skills that you bring. And I see that's a trend, especially in technology companies, that I've really appreciated. One of the other things that we've done, unfortunately by law, is the Colorado Equal Pay Act has required us to post our complete pay scale for the role within the job posting. And so I have loved that because it's been an incredible opportunity to be transparent up front and also allow candidates to self-select in or self-select out based on that, and have very transparent conversations right off the bat around compensation and motivation as well.
Yeah, and you kind of just double clicking on some of that as well, that around the job description and just some of the scenarios that you typically run into is that there's a boilerplate, and I think boilerplates can be really dangerous, in particular as the business changes. So you start out with this framework that maybe worked, 24 months ago, and then all of a sudden you have all these new roles and you put this framework out there and it doesn't really match what you're doing in 2022. It looks a lot more like 2020. Right. And I think anybody who's been involved in business in the last 2 years knows that things have changed pre-COVID and post-COVID in terms of how most businesses are set up. So if you're using that 2019 boilerplate, it's time to revisit it and stop trying to copy and paste and put a little bit more legwork in making sure that the roles that you have not only reflect what you're looking for, but also sound exciting based on real world scenarios in 2022.
I would add that perhaps, doing a direct copy and paste for a lot of templates or job descriptions out there could be a little dangerous because it's not as nuanced. And, kind of to our question, you want as much clarity as possible. So that includes personalization to your given environment. And to Emily's point about particular skill sets that you're looking for based on the job role. But it is a good start if you don't have anything in place to build from. Wonderful. And I'm curious, Emily, I know we discussed this a little bit prior, but the legislation that was put out by the Colorado state government, is that something that you think is going to catch on with regards to mandatory visibility into salary ranges for all job descriptions?
Yeah, I do. And I know, gosh, I should have Googled this before our meeting, but I've seen another 1 or 2 states just recently made that requirement as well. So I do think it will be a trend as we move forward.
Scott, maybe you could offer some perspective as to what that added visibility into salary ranges, how that's going to help streamline the process in the long run as well.
I think it's just another expectation setting tool. Comfortable once they're part of the process. On the expectation side, up and down where you could potentially land. That way, if you come in with very big expectations, your expectations are set. Or, maybe some people are bad negotiators and just simply don't like the idea of negotiation. And this is really a way to inject a little bit of fairness in that, because it would be very easy. I know it happened to me early in my career where you just kind of take that first offer. And in fact, maybe you could have done something a little bit better on the candidate side of the house. So I think that there's just some comfort in that on the candidate side of the house. And then on the hiring side, I mean, just the idea that you have some tools to say, hey, listen, this is the range and this is what good looks like for our organization. I think that helps the recruiter manage that conversation, in particular with people that aren't comfortable around it.
True. It also seems to build some earlier trust between the recruiter and the candidate when you don't have to have that difficult conversation that is often the stickiest part of that intake. I think one of the things that also this brings to mind is that it also will illuminate some discrepancies or some shortcomings of organizations that are perhaps underpaying their internal staff. If they're required, and their internal employees, if they're required to show salary, then that's something that not only is visible to candidates or prospective job seekers, but also to the existing employees at the organization, which opens up an entirely new level of transparency.
Well, even the redeployment conversation, right? As you redeploy into new jobs, like let's say you move from customer success into product, that there is a level of visibility there and also a level of comfort for that employee. And I actually think it probably makes your redeployment programs more effective in some ways.
Yeah. It's been a fun benchmarking tool as well. Like it's made that a little bit easier for, I'm going to go search any competitors or any of the same roles out there in Colorado where I know they're required to post. And I can say, okay, are we, how are we trending to market? Are we going to be able to be competitive or not? And just do a simple search on that and get information really quickly.
Very cool. I know that Workable is actually putting together a salary calculator. Stay tuned. It'll be a free tool available to all job seekers. Let's go right into our third question. I would love to understand, and Emily, we'll start with you on this one. I would love to understand some ideas on how both parties involved in interviewing, both the candidate and the interviewer, can make the most of that delicate and dedicated time that they have with each other. What are some tips that you would offer for both sides?
Yeah. For candidates, I think it's being as clear as you can on why you're interested in the role in that company and what you're looking for. Ultimately, we want it to be a good match and a good long-term match. And that's part of what recruiters are always probing for. And I think on the recruiter side, it's being really doing all the work, I think, on the back end. So being able to align with the hiring manager on what those needs are, the information that they really need to feel comfortable moving forward with a candidate so that we're not wasting anyone's time and it's a good use and we're getting to the source of the skill set and the needs. I know for us, one of the things we've been really putting some effort into is, again, our software engineers. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but our software engineer interview process, it's pretty lengthy, pretty involved. And I am encouraging our leaders, to put themselves in the candidate shoes and say, okay, how much of this time would you dedicate and how much of this process and how do we think about what we're asking in the process to avoid and eliminate any redundancies and also get what we need earlier in the process so they're not getting to interview for only to find out it's not a match or they don't have the skill set. So how do we fix that a little bit further upstream?
Excellent. Scott?
Yeah, and when I think about this question is that how do you make the most of it? It's kind of how do you get more for less? And in particular in tech interviewing, but I actually think it's across the board, is how do you get to where you need to be having the fewest steps possible with the most efficiency possible? And I know in the tech world, it's where we're going to set up 7 or 8 interviews and we're going to bring in a VP of sales or a C-level employee. And that all is great if you can set it up, but scaling that is extremely hard. Most tech companies, if you look at the calendar of the VP of sales or you look at the calendar of somebody in the C-level, you're not going to find very many gaps in that calendar. And so having to schedule around that with the candidate's time, and let's say there's 5 candidates, well, that's going to kick out the timelines. And so in today's market, I don't even think that makes sense. There has to be a way of doing more with less. And that's getting the right people involved in the process to evaluate the skills that are important for that particular role. And if you're ready to make an offer, make the offer. Don't wait to get particular titles if you can still vet the skills with other folks to kind of down the line. And I think that candidates will appreciate that as well, because we've all probably been there at some way, shape, or form where there's two companies you may be interviewing with. And in the end, you end up going with a company that it out executes the other one because they were quicker about it, not necessarily because they were better. And so I think that you can do that with your process. Having fewer interviews would just impact people around the role as opposed to everyone up the chain, as well as having technology that can manage that whole process end to end in a very, very seamless and efficient way.
So maybe not so much what we do within the interview itself, but how do we go about making those interviews as necessary and as tight as possible by sort of circumventing or finding operational efficiencies between the interviews to sort of tighten that process up a little bit, to Emily's point about making sure that the process is clear cut up front. And Scott, to your point as well about, just making sure that if someone's going to talk to somebody else, that we have sort of the notes behind the scene and we're making best use of that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's going to protect your brand too, because as with anyone, if you've had a poor interview experience or you feel like that someone has wasted your time, you're going to remember that brand. And it might not be as true in tech, but if you think about light industrial, like quick serve restaurants, typically the people that come work for you are your customers. So if you treat them poorly, I can guarantee you they're going to be eating somewhere else.
That's a good point. Emily, anything else to add on this?
Yeah, I was processing what Scott was sharing and thinking about the brand piece as well. What I think about is we have had situations where I think maybe there's been less confidence in maybe new leaders, whether they're newly promoted or new to the company, to make good hiring decisions. And so then we've added people on in the end, and it's just not. I haven't had a great experience with that. And I think it can make you look disjointed or unorganized unintentionally when you're not addressing some of those issues on the front end. And so, you have a candidate coming through the process and you're like, hey, there's going to be 4 interviews and then decision. And then suddenly it's like, well, actually, one more interview. And what naturally goes through all of our minds is, oh, is there something wrong with me? Like, what are they vetting out? What is the question, when it has really literally nothing to do with the candidate, or usually isn't the case, and it's more of a company issue. And so just doing what we can to avoid that and align on that on the front end always helps.
But also not being able to, open up and be a little more transparent on the fact that this is a work in process and a work in progress. And as such, things change. And so keeping
an accurate representation of startup life, sometimes things change quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Life in general,
communication is key.
Days.
Yeah, communication is key around all of those things.
Speaking of communication, let's jump to our next question. I'm really curious, and Scott, we'll start with you on this one. Can you offer some tips on, as far as internal communications go, tips for shortening feedback loops between all folks involved in the hiring process behind the scenes? So recruiting, hiring managers, cross-functional stakeholders within an organization. What are some tips that you see regarding communication and shortening those feedback loops?
Yeah, I think that quick sync right after the interview panel, in particular if you run them serially, is really, really important, because if you get everyone's feedback, if you work at a tech company, at least, you might do 10, 20, 30 interviews over the course of a month. So number one, you want the freshness of that feedback to be correct. Otherwise, you're going to get very generic and unhelpful feedback. Number two is, if you kind of rally everybody together, you're going to get a pretty good consensus, I think, pretty quickly. And anybody who can't participate, you want the technology tools to make those contributions right away as well. So if there's a way to reach out to the interviewer and say, you just had the interview, put your feedback in here, please attend this meeting. And if all of that can be managed within a technology ecosystem, I think you're increasing your likelihood of success. You're also going to be getting back to the candidate much more quickly, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that feedback is shared, good, bad, or indifferent, in some way, shape, or form. And I think that quick feedback loop, the very quick sync, and then having technology to fill in the gaps is the right way to go.
That may be a little biased, but that's where I think most organizations could benefit from an applicant tracking system. That'll be my one short commercial and done. Emily, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, we've done something slightly different at Red Canary that I've seen be incredibly beneficial, and it's varied on the level of role, but that is even setting up a kickoff call so that one, the interviewers are aligned on the expectations of when we expect your feedback to be in, and how quickly we expect that. So just defining those SLAs up front. I think also getting the buy-in of how important their feedback is and why they're a part of the interview panel so that they feel like they are an important part of the process. And then from there, even when the recruiter moves to the intake, having that weekly cadence to connect with the hiring managers. So if they're having one-offs, we're collecting that information and understanding when the debriefs will be. So setting those up, scheduling them ahead of time so that there is, if schedules change and things happen, as they always do, you at least have that defined time to connect with everyone to gather that feedback pretty quickly.
Emily, have you encountered organizations or have you heard any anecdotes of organizations where when those SLAs are sort of established up front and then there's a breach, how to go about tactfully getting people re-engaged, stakeholders within the process internally, and to do so while maintaining that sense of urgency while not sounding like you're nagging?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a tough balance to not sound like you're nagging, because we often have to remember is recruiting is our job, but recruiting is just a fraction and a small percentage of a leader's job. And so, there have been breaches. We have set SLAs up front. There have been breaches of that verbal contract,
Sure.
and us setting in advance the escalation for that. Frankly, if it's not maintained. Typically, what I've experienced is you can really quickly get them back in when you share, hey, we're losing candidates, or here's kind of what will happen and what I've seen happen. And just the simple deprioritization of their role. If they're not getting you feedback and not being responsive, sends a pretty clear message. Not the one I like to send or how I prefer to send it, but
if push comes to shove, right? Scott, anything else to add on this, or shall we jump to our next question?
I think we can jump to the next question.
All right, sounds good. With that, there are 2 questions left here, folks. I strongly encourage to our attendees that if you are interested in asking a question, if something sparked a situation that you would like our panel of experts to comment on, please click into the Q&A tab. It's right at the top of the chat window to the right of your screen. You'll see Q&A. We already have a question from Diamond Hernandez. Thank you so much for submitting that. Submit your question there to make sure that we see it. If you ask it in the chat, we will probably lose it. So make sure to ask it in Q&A. We want to save some time at the end of today's webinar to answer your attendee questions. With that, let's go back to what we had slated. And Emily, again, we'll start with you for this one. What are some ways, now that we've talked about how to keep the feedback loops tight and consistent in the back end for organizations during the hiring process, what are some ways to keep candidates engaged between steps in the hiring journey? I don't have the science in front of me, but let's just say that people are a little bit harder to keep their attention these days. And even when it comes to, especially in light of the great redistribution of our workforce over the past few years, that folks are scattered. Folks have got a lot of opportunities. It's a candidate playland out there. How do we go about keeping them engaged with your brand or with your organization between steps along the hiring journey?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that we go about doing that. One, again, I think is setting expectations early in the process in the initial screen around what to expect so they know. I think you can't always define the timeline in which things will happen, but you can say, hey, here's what the process looks like today. And so they know how many interviews there will be, and they can start to plan throughout that process. Some things that we've done to keep candidates engaged in the process is send just emails here and there. And we're exploring the option of sending text messages, but emails with a note or an anecdote about, hey, we've won this award, or here's what we're working on, or check us out here. And just pinging them to keep them engaged with our brand and remind them. One of the other things I've seen my team do is before a final interview, reach out proactively to the candidate and ask them if they want to connect for 15 or 30 minutes and offer that up. So if there are any outstanding questions, concerns, things that have come up, they feel incredibly prepped going into that final meeting to succeed.
I love the concept of doing a more or less almost a marketing push for your brand or your organization between steps, knowing that it's a two-way interview and that you're keeping your brand fresh in their mind, and that there could be a number of conversations that are going on. I think that's a really smart tip. Scott, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, same type deal. It's to me, the communication is key, and it's hard for everyone to get on the phone and call every single person that's in the funnel for each and every step, which means that technology is a very important part and piece of this puzzle. And Emily mentioned the concept of texting. I think it's great. I think that ability to have some type of capability to reach out to the candidates, keep a pulse on the candidate, and then have some form of AI wrapped around those texts where there can be some interactivity without necessarily having to have a recruiter engage, but it's smart enough to engage the recruiter if you're getting back a message, you're like, I need to get ahead of this, because without that communication, there's going to be lack of transparency. And without transparency in the funnel, there's going to be candidate fallout. And that's going to be true whether you're talking about contingent workers in the staffing world all the way into high-tech workers at tech companies, because everyone wants to know where they stand. And I also believe even after a candidate, let's say they've been offered a job and they're in between that period between when they start and onboard and having accepted the job, communication is also key there. So those very same tech tools can be aimed at the candidate after they've accepted the offer pre-onboarding and perhaps even during onboarding, because in my point of view, important information needs to get to the candidate all the time, and they should have some outlet for communication. And that should be true whether they accept a job, whether they're offered a job, whether they're given feedback. Hey, look, right now is not the right time for you here, because if you keep that pulse with a candidate, there's going to come a time, your company's scaling, where you might need their skill set. So the more communication, the better, and the easier it is to communicate, the better. And technology is going to be at the underpinning of all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We tend to have a bit of a myopic view, especially if we hire within a certain industry. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made, like everyone has an email address and they check it regularly. There are a lot of industries out there, truck drivers, transportation specialists, that have they're not in front of their email, but they do have their cell phone. And so having a tool like text messaging to be able to continue that conversation, keep that transparency there, is almost an imperative from a cross-industry perspective.
Yeah, in food service, you actually can't hire because people don't own laptops. So you're exactly right. It's you better have that ability to go to some type of mobile device for all your hiring processes, but it's not across the board. I worked with this company where they owned multiple brands of restaurants. So they owned a kind of a breakfast style, like diner style set of brands, and then they owned a really cool pizza brand. Well, typically what they were explaining was the different generations that worked in those brands. So it might be Gen Z at the cool pizza brand. It might be a baby boomer that's working at the diner brand. And so you have to be able to accommodate how people can interact with the technology as well, because it could come to pass that there are some things that technology can't solve, and you need to have that recruiter that can be a little bit more proactive based on the role and what you're hiring for.
Very true. Emily, anything else on this?
Yeah, one of the other thoughts that sparked too, somewhat related, where Scott was talking about transparency, is one of the things I've always tried to do is be transparent with the candidate in terms of, hey, I do have a lot of requisitions, or I do have a lot on my plate. And so I welcome you reaching out and you initiating that as well, and being as sincere as possible, and knowing that it is a two-way street, because just because I'm not reaching out, please don't take that as a lack of interest or a lack of excitement about your background. And so please know this is truly a two-way street. And I think that's helped me be successful because it truly enables the candidate to reach out.
Yeah, because the other thing that sits behind all this is just the concept of ghosting. And I think employers ghost candidates, and I think candidates ghost employers, and it's extraordinarily frustrating. So whatever you can do to provide that feedback and transparency, you should do. I have my own personal story. When I first started my career, I interviewed at this consulting firm, and I probably spent 3 hours on the phone. I went and did an in-person interview. This was probably 6-7 hour commitment, and they ghosted me. At the end of the whole process, I didn't even get a call that said, I didn't even get a little like note card in the mail 6 months later. They ghosted me. Wow. And a recruiter 10 years later reached out to me. And I was like, I can't believe this company is reaching out to me. And I'm hitting reply with my petty response. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's like, I'm going to play the bigger person here. But I remembered that. I remembered that brand from 10 years ago. And that's how people think of your brand. And you might be a new recruiter and walk right into that and go, whoa, wait a minute. Why is this guy so upset? Because you remember getting ghosted.
Not only do you remember them, but you are telling the story right now. And so obviously it sticks with you. That makes a ton of sense. Speaking of like the fear of being ghosted, on both sides, right? Do you think that leads the candidates from a cross-industry perspective to be a little more open to asynchronous forms of interaction beyond email? So utilizing tools like video interviewing or our assessments outside of an engineering or a specialist field becoming more commonplace? Do you see that as something that is being more widely adopted by the candidate pool across industries?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that also too, like if you think about tech, I mean, there used to be hubs of tech talent, and there still are, but people have spread out all across the country in the last 2 years. So all of those remote tools and techniques are a must-have now. It's just simply table stakes. That asynchronous communication is, to me, a way of life, and that people expect that. For years, I've lived in the Tampa Bay area, and so I would interview with San Francisco Bay Area companies, and they would say, okay, do you live in the San Francisco Bay Area? I'd say, well, I live in the Bay Area. just not that one. But now it's much more common. And I think all of that is an expectation of the modern candidate. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Emily, how about you?
Well, I think it can imply how much of an investment your company makes in the hiring process on the front end, and also how much they value technology, or even how much foresight they have and forward thinking, depending on some of the tools and processes that you use. So I think it can be very much a reflection of the company. And I think that goes into the candidate evaluation of it is, what tools are you using? How do you integrate technology? How forward thinking are you? So I think that's in the back of their mind in any part of the process.
That's if you're asking someone to live schedule the next meeting, versus, well, let me send you some times. Sometimes that could be as indicative on your progressiveness towards technology adoption for the organization. I love that. You're marketing yourself even in the tools that you use for the hiring process. Makes a ton of sense. Thank you. All right, last question that I have, and then we'll go to our attendee Q&A, is I'd love to close out with just some best practices, being as how we're talking with our partner, or we're working with our partner Checkr here, but give me some best practices and Scott, would love to start with you on this, some best practices that we have to keep background screens, those pesky background screens, the bane of existence when it comes to the hiring process, right? How do we keep them from delaying candidate start dates?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of the reason Checkr as a company exists. This industry is 40 or 50 years old. It started as pen and paper or lie detector services or something along those lines. Over time, it grew through acquisition, and over time, then technology pieces and parts got put into those different acquisitions. And so there's this tapestry of technology with some manual processes. And what ends up on the other end of that is you have this very opaque process around something very serious, because a background check can be used as a vetting tool on whether you're appropriate or not for a particular role. So it's a very scary process for a candidate who is looking for a position to pay their bills and live their life. So with all of that in mind, you want to have the ability to properly set the candidate's expectations on, this is what a background check is. This is what's happening. And this is the process that's going to be in place. And this is where you go to monitor how long this is going to take. Those types of things, while they may exist somewhere in background screening, the modern platforms like Checkr, we have the ability to use data points, to use forecasting modules from an artificial intelligence point of view that's going to be correct, down to the day, 9 out of 10 times on when that background screen comes back. So
that's great.
The benefit of that is that you have this ability to properly set expectations, because that's where people typically fall out of the funnel. In particular, as you get a little more into the light industrial side of the house, is if that background screen doesn't come back, I assure you, if it takes 5, 10, however many days, that candidate is going to be in several other hiring funnels, and they're going to get hired by the time that background check is going to come back, because so many organizations are looking to hire quickly. So you want to set expectations appropriately. And then on the employer side of the house, you want to use background screens that are appropriate. And in our world, in the background check world, we talk about the nature test. So it's the nature of the job. It's the time since a criminal violation that's on your record, and it's the nature of that criminal violation. And so you want to have appropriate adjudication processes that match what you need for the job. And the example I always give is that I live in Florida. It would be very easy for someone that doesn't fish very much, like myself. If a friend of mine says, hey, I'm going out on the boat fishing, and I were to go with him, and I was to stick a fishing pole in the water, if I don't have a license, that's a fishing game violation. And that would go on my record. And it's not that difficult for that to happen to you. So in that scenario, is there a world where if you're going to go work at a company that should keep you or prevent you from having a job? The answer is probably not. I have worked with companies where they actually go out on professional fishing expeditions where it would, but in most cases, it shouldn't prevent you from having a job. So we call that fair chance hiring at Checkr. So even if you have something on your record, if it's not relevant to the job, filter it out, because the benefit for the business is that you open your candidate pool, because 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record. Let that sink in. 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record. And if you're filtering them all out, there's your hiring shortage right there. And chances are there are going to be excellent hires in that 1 in 3 based on the roles you have. So if you have intelligent technology that can sift through all those charges correctly, and then you say, these are the charges we care about, and these are the charges we don't care about, not only can you hire more, but your internal team that's responsible for evaluating all those will have less work to do because you've filtered out charges that don't matter to you. So there's a lot around the background check topic, but it's the concept of transparency and that nature test that you want to make sure you can configure in the technology that has the dual benefit of opening your candidate pool while at the same time de-risking all things work related as well.
So keep that in mind, folks out there with fish and wildlife violations. Don't let this keep you idle. All right, move forward. Emily, how about some feet on the street stories? What are some anecdotes that you have and applications that you've used internally to help Red Canary hire quickly and not let the background check drag you down?
Yeah, I think so. I've had a background in finance where they used to do credit checks, and then healthcare, which has been pretty stringent. So moving to the tech space, one of the first things I asked was, hey, what do we check? And like, how did we decide that? Because much like Scott said, like fixing that upstream can oftentimes what I've seen is they are too stringent in backgrounds in general, and they don't necessarily have the education or reasoning as to why they're doing that. It's just like, oh, this is what my vendor told me. And thankfully we have a great partnership, and it's been really successful. So we've not had any challenges. Anecdotally, what I've seen in the past is when you don't have a great vendor or you're not aligned on the appropriate things or the things that matter are impactful to the background, is candidate delays. Many times they want to get through that because they want that affirmation of like, all right, I'm good to go. So they won't give their notice. And then, that starts to push out their start date. Or if you do have delays because what was expected or needed upfront wasn't communicated appropriately, then the candidate has given their notice. And now you're stuck feeling like you might need to compensate them for a week or two that they're not working because you're simply waiting on their background check. And they're like, hey, I'm losing money now. Like, I've given my notice, I'm done. This is not my fault. So I've seen that in other industries, but thankfully with our great partnership with Checkr, we've not had any challenges with turning those around really quickly and have the appropriate level of monitoring.
Excellent. Great. Well, that wraps up our 6 questions lined to 6 tips to make your hiring process more efficient and effective. Let's go over to our audience Q&A here. I would love to start off by the original submission from Diamond Hernandez. This one's a 2-parter. Conceptually, is a fast hiring process always better? And more on a tactical note, how long should the full hiring process be if all schedules align perfectly? Scott, you want to start us off with this?
Yeah, sure. I think it depends on what you're hiring. So we work with organizations like tech companies where there's going to be a longer process, several weeks to up to a month, where there's going to be a number of different experiential interviews along the way. But we also work with companies that are direct sourcing companies. And what a direct sourcing company does is think about baggage handlers that are needed at the airport this afternoon. A couple people ghost, got to have some baggage handlers. So in that scenario, quicker is absolutely a necessity. And also in that scenario, you're talking about something like we talk about background screening. You have to pre-screen a candidate pool. So you have to have a ready-made candidate pool that's ready to go. And so speed is of the essence. Most of what we talked about today is not that, but that is one scenario. Then you get more into kind of the high-tech hires. I think that if you're going into months around a high-tech hire, you should expect candidates to be hired off elsewhere, especially if they're in demand for in-demand roles. I think that if you have that one experiential hire, maybe that's the presentation or the group discussion or group interview. After that, you need to make your decision. So it's how do you get that candidate qualified? How do you move them through that right interview panel? If there is some type of experiential piece, get it done and then make a decision and then communicate that decision as quickly as you can. Obviously, that's not hiring for this afternoon at the airport, but
sure,
certainly if it's bleeding into months, you're in trouble.
Yeah. I would follow that up with, I don't know that, I think the word I would replace with fast is streamlined. I think a streamlined interview process is really important so that it's clear and so that you can get the appropriate decision makers and move candidates along quickly. I don't always know that I prioritize fast because sometimes when you move fast, you can overlook really important things. And I think there's value to having multiple candidates and contrast and comparison for roles. And it sounds like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. I just think there's a lot to consider in that question.
Right.
You know, with the candidate pool and the market as it is, like, yes, hire as quickly and as streamlined as you can while still making really good, having the proper things in place, the proper interviewers in place to help make good decisions quickly.
Right. So it's not how fast, it's hire as quick as it needs to. Hire as quick as you can. I had it, but then I lost it. Hire. It's not hire fast. It should take as long as it takes. I blew it. Never mind.
Good luck streamlining that.
It was a bumper sticker. I had it, but now I lost it. All right. Let's just move on to the next audience question from Kimberly Gassner Harkness. With regards to the communication piece, do you have a standard or like a golden ratio between email, text, and phone calls? This is obviously going to vary industry to industry depending on who your ideal candidate is, but what's a good balance that you've seen be most effective for you? Yeah, Emily, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with that one. For me, there is no magic ratio. I think the balance is meeting the candidates where they are. So how they prefer to be communicated with, whether that's text or email. Like I just went through hiring 2 VPs of sales, both of which I would not have texted regularly, but they communicated with me that way. And so I took my clues from that and said, okay, then that's how we're going to communicate. And then when we needed to have more lengthy conversations or talk in more detail, of course, making those phone calls. The way I think about it is every time a candidate is touched by someone in our hiring process, I like to just have a follow-up to that, even if it's just a standard email like we talked about earlier, or just, hey, just checking in to make sure things went well, or what that might be.
Yeah, and I don't have a recommendation here, but this is where I would say that a lot of that can be managed by your tech platform. So you might want to work with your vendor because they may have, if like a Workable, for instance, has worked with hundreds or thousands of companies, there may be a starter kit or some best practices that they can share to say, hey, this is how we typically get set up first, and then you're going to want to tune it based on your situation and the type of business that you have.
Okay, you mentioned that is part of our hiring plan, so thank you very much, Scott. I also remember what it was, by the way. It should take as long as it takes, but no longer. There we go.
There we go. I knew it was worth the wait.
Right.
Send it to the printer.
It was a real build up there. That was real tangible. It was a palpable tension in the air. Okay. From Lindsay Lake, our next question: how often do you collect references? Do you always do it, never do it, or is it circumstantial? There's been some mixed feedback over the years. So what are your thoughts on references in general, and how much should that feed into the process?
Yeah, I'm happy
Scott,
to start with that one too.
Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, Emily, please do, because I'm going to give a background check.
Yeah. Listen, the question I pose back to hiring managers is, have you ever talked to a reference and it was negative? Like, people handpick who they want you to talk to for a reason. So I am not a huge fan or advocate of collecting or asking for references. What I do say is, if there's something where you have a specific question around how they worked with a team or how their communication was, that you feel like you would just like to have a little bit more information, then I think there's value in talking to a reference and asking around that specific question. But just generally speaking, like if you're doing it for the sake of doing it, I've not had that be a good use of time.
And likewise, you can have a background screening company check references as well. I don't think you get quite the personalization as someone like Emily and Emily's team that you would get firsthand, but you certainly can have that, and that's a good way of scaling out the process. I don't disagree with Emily's philosophies, but there's potentially multiple ways to go about checking those references if you wanted to.
Great. Scott, this one's for you. And knowing that sometimes things move at the speed of light for early stage tech companies, how stringent do you recommend that those background checks be for said early stage tech companies who may often hire just on a whim, on a notion?
Yeah, so every company has their own risk profile in terms of what they're looking to accomplish. There's pretty basic packages you can get set up for employees. If you have, let's say, a net new startup, there could be things that you want to look at with respect to maybe any intellectual property concerns. There could be things that are specific to tech companies, but usually there's a set of standard background check packages that you can set up very quickly to get a lay of the land without necessarily checking everything under the sun, because you can, if you want to, check many, 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 many different things. You can do federal checks for the federal court system if you wanted to. You can check many different electronic registries, which is relatively easy because they're all just database searches. You can have very specific types of criminal background screens. But most vendors, including Checkr, you can set up with a standard set of packages, and those packages can be kicked off very easily, in particular if they're embedded with technology like Workable, where it's just simply a point and a click with a standard set of packages, and you can get started very, very quickly.
Excellent. This one's going to you, Emily, a separate question. This one's coming from Althea Williams. What are the primary considerations for salary setting, given the transparency of pay ranges in Colorado, your state? And what tools are you using to manage internal equity, if that is a part of your pay model?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I'm the best person to truly answer that. I wasn't part of the process in setting that up with our company. And I would I'd feel slightly uncomfortable answering that just because it wasn't me who initiated that. I think what some of the conversations are that we have around it are, one, we have a tool that we use, like a benchmarking tool, that you can filter it down, different industries, different roles, and if you're startup versus a large company, and by number of employees. So I think we use kind of a general tool for that to help us level set expectations. What I'm appreciative of is our executive team and our comp team is really receptive to not just what the data tells us, but what the market is telling us. So as we are interviewing candidates or as we're going out there and researching, we're able to adjust for the market appropriately. And what it has done in terms of internal equity, I've seen it play out that we've held ourselves accountable to, if the market changes, then making those changes for our internal teammates as well. So it's not a situation in which they see something being posted at a higher level or a higher compensation going, wait, I'm in that job, why am I not getting the same pay? They really do that proactively.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more question. This one is coming from Becky Halverson, and maybe regarding the post-interview process, how do we make this more efficient in actually getting candidate feedback? Do any of you send out survey to candidates regarding their experience with the company, I assume, in the interview process?
Might be a little bit out of where I typically work. I mean, I know that we do some polling around new hires and part of the onboarding process to make it as quickly as we possibly can. The piece that I'm typically involved in on the pre-hire side with background screens, one of the areas that we do collect feedback or allow candidates to effectively give feedback is if you were to have charges on your background check, we offer the ability to have a candidate story. So if there's a reason something happened, and believe me, there are some crazy charges that if you actually figured out what they were charging, you would be like, well, I don't even understand why that person was charged in the first place. That ability to explain those charges on your background is one way that candidates can provide feedback and give them some level of transparency and control over the process. I know that wasn't the question, but I figured it was relevant.
Yeah, that's something we've certainly talked about. I don't use one today. I've thought about developing one because I do want feedback on our process. And I think sometimes when candidates drop out of your interview process, or they say, oh, I had another offer, like, well, what does that really mean? Like, was our salary not competitive? Did you just not like the team? Was the process taking too long? Like, what they're telling you might not be the sole reason. And so I think it's a really good question to ask and something I'm looking to implement.
Great. Good to know. Well, we are running up to the top of the hour. I appreciate, Emily, both you and Scott, for joining us today. Some enlightening tips on helping to streamline the process. Remember, it takes as long as it needs to and no longer. I think that's what it was. T-shirts coming to my Etsy shop. For your SHRM credit, be sure to check the chat. It's activity 22-5D6RY. So check the chat and make sure to save that SHRM code for 1 hour of certification credit. Again, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Emily, for your time today. We hope that our audience got some nuggets. The recording will be made available if you were only able to experience part of this, which I think our third panelist will appreciate. So thank you again for joining us. We hope to do this again with you really soon. Keep an eye on your inbox again for the full recording, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.